Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we bring you another example of why individuals shouldn't have power over others without accountability. The Gilded Age of the late 1800s is a special time in human history. Otherwise unremarkable individuals became obscenely wealthy, and many of them believed this made them better than everyone else. For the discerning tycoon who wanted to uphold his morals and increase profits, the idea of the company town was born. The company could create a planned community where workers lived, and it could control every decision the employees made to ensure they increased shareholder value. For one prominent industrialist, this ended in violence. Today we are going to tell you how a Gilded Age industrialist triggered one of the largest labor movements in United States history. Paternalism and the company town. Throughout the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution radically reshaped daily life. Instead of laboring on farms, more and more people moved to cities and began working for companies that employed large numbers of employees. Automobiles didn't exist yet, so they needed to live closer to the factories and mines that supplied their income. As a result, entire communities were built near industrial centers. In some cases, an entire town depended upon a single company for all its income. As the new titans of industry became wealthier and increasingly powerful, they turned their attention to the employees that made it possible. Most of the people who worked for these growing industries were poor and uneducated. Furthermore, they were almost completely trapped in the communities where they lived. Additionally, many among the upper class believed in the concept of paternalism. The elite, who controlled massive amounts of capital, thought it was their religious and moral duty to force proper behavior upon their employees. It would not only improve their lives, but it would increase value for shareholders as well. The more motivated members of the upper class practiced this belief by purchasing entire communities that existed near factories and mines. The companies would control every aspect of the town, including how its members behaved. Employees and residents would buy food from stores owned by their employer. They would pay rent to the same employer. As a result, most of the pay earned by workers went back into the pockets of wealthy owners. Most importantly, if any of the employees behaved in an inappropriate manner, they could be removed from their homes. One of the first examples of a company town appeared in England. In 1887, a soap company began building its own village called Port Sunlight. Today, it is a suburb of the metropolitan borough of Wirral. However, for many decades, the small village dictated what residents could and could not do. They were required to attend religious services and abstain from alcohol and other vices. The company also provided a much higher quality of life than many others enjoyed at the time. George Cadbury was the third son of John Cadbury. John Cadbury was a Quaker who founded the Cadbury's Chocolate Company. In 1888, George decided that to grow the business, he needed to build a town that was dedicated to serving it, so the village of Bourneville was created right outside of Birmingham, England. By 1900, several hundred people were living there. The village was full of recreation areas and encouraged residents to exercise and enjoy the outdoors. By most accounts, it was a pleasant place to live. Around the same time that company towns emerged in England, they began appearing in the United States as well, but most of them were far less pleasant than their British counterparts. Although some of these restrictive communities seemed to improve life for their residents, most of them had the opposite effect. In many cases, these towns were a tool used by the wealthy to control and punish employees. It was also a way to further profit from their misfortune. One American industrialist would create his own company town only to discover that it was possible to push people too far. The Inventor. George Pullman was born in Brockton, New York on March 3, 1831. George spent his early childhood helping his father, who was a carpenter and an inventor. In 1841, his father patented a machine that could be used to lift buildings. The family moved closer to the Erie Canal so the Pullman family could use the invention to make a profit. The canal needed to be widened, so the machine that lifted buildings became a very useful tool for helping construction efforts move forward. George Pullman attended local schools but dropped out before graduating. When his father died in 1855, he took over the family business. In 1856, he had his first success when a contract to move 20 buildings was granted by the state of New York. But George was not content to simply live off contracts offered by New York, so in 1857 he went to Chicago. The city was about to build one of the nation's first large sewer systems. To do this, they needed to lift buildings several feet. George and his partners won the contract. They began helping Chicago rebuild the city. Raising buildings was a profitable business, but George wanted more than his father's inventions could offer. He wanted to create something that was entirely his own. As a child, he watched boats travel up and down the Erie Canal. One type of craft which moved along the waterway was packet boats. Passengers who occupied these boats usually traveled in relative luxury compared to the other options available for travelers. George decided he could create something similar for the railroad. In 1864, he created the first sleeping car. It provided beds so that passengers could rest during their travels. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his body traveled home in a sleeping car. It was effective advertising for George's offering to the world. Within a few years, this new idea would expand to accommodate the wealthy members of 19th century society. In 1867, a new type of sleeping car was introduced. It was called a hotel on wheels. The attached kitchen and dining car provided a gourmet dining experience which rivaled some of the best restaurants of the day. Over the next several years, George Pullman continued to increase his market share in the railroad. By 1875, his company owned hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of patents. It also operated over 700 railroad cars. George was respected throughout the world as an intelligent and industrious man. After mastering capitalism, he had another mission. For his company to become truly great, he needed to solve poverty and end labor issues. Pullman Company Town. In 1880, George Pullman purchased 4,000 acres, about 14 miles south of Chicago. He then hired an architect named Solon Spencer Beeman to design buildings for the new community. First, a factory was built nearby. This was the place where workers would create the products that George Pullman sold to wealthy customers. Then, around the factory, a small town was built. It contained houses, theaters, parks, a hotel, a library, and even a church. George explained his motives for building this community. That such advantages and surroundings made better workmen by removing them from the feeling of discontent and desire for change which so generally characterize the American workman, thus protecting the employer from loss of time and money consequent upon intemperance, labor strikes, and dissatisfaction, which generally result from poverty and uncongenial home surroundings. The new town, unsurprisingly, was called Pullman. And although it was intended to solve problems, it sadly created new ones. First, the homes reflected the status of those who occupied them. The average employee lived in small rows of brick houses that were built right next to each other. Managers had a large house, complete with a backyard. Visiting executives were treated to the most luxurious homes available in the community. The town also had several rules which were strictly enforced. First, there was no alcohol allowed. Also, the employees that lived in Pullman had to pay rent. The rent was deducted from employee pay before they received it. Food expenses incurred by employees were also removed from their pay. But that was just the beginning. George Pullman ruled over his town with an iron fist. He prohibited the existence of independent newspapers. Public speeches and town meetings were not allowed without Pullman's permission. Open discussion in general among the residents was prohibited. Inspectors were appointed by George to help maintain these strict standards. They would randomly enter the homes of employees without warning and inspect them for cleanliness. The inspectors would also look for contraband. If they didn't like what was found, then the entire family could be evicted with just 10 days' notice. In public, George Pullman claimed that he was helping his employees have a better quality of life. Newspapers all over the world praised him for his charity and far-reaching vision of the future. In private, he expected the planned community to make a profit. This would soon lead to a series of unpleasant events. The Pullman Strike. The United States economy grew quickly between 1870 and 1890. However, most of that was due to international commodity prices being very high during these years. In 1893, several crop failures in Argentina contributed to prices crashing. By the end of the year, the United States was in the throes of an economic depression. Recovery would not happen until 1897. But in the meantime, George Pullman was determined to hold on to his fortune and increase profits. He responded to the depression by cutting wages for his workers. Most of them saw their pay decrease by 30%, but rent and food prices did not change. This meant that many people would work hard all week and receive almost nothing in return since expenses were deducted from their pay. One unknown person who lived in Pullman commented, "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die we shall go to the Pullman hell." Another worker testified to the cruelty of George Pullman's economic policies. "I have seen men with families of 8 or 9 children crying because they got only 3 or 4 cents after paying their rent." Eugene Victor Debs was the founder of the Socialist Party of America. He also ran for president 5 times. For railroad workers, his most important achievement was establishing the American Railway Union in February 1893. On May 12, 1894, he convinced the workers at Pullman's company that they had to stand up for themselves. The workers decided to go on strike. As production was brought to a halt, George Pullman refused to negotiate with the union. He locked up his home, shut down the business, and left. Rather than crush the strike, his employees became enraged. Railroad workers began removing Pullman's cars from trains. They also did everything they could to keep trains from moving through Chicago. The striking workers effectively shut down rail traffic throughout much of the country. This also included mail being delivered by the post office. Eugene Debs agreed to let mail cars travel through the picket lines as a compromise with the government. However, railroad companies exploited this situation by mixing mail with their other deliveries. Workers became angry at this tactic and began shutting down railroad traffic again. The press was not sympathetic. The New York Times said that Eugene Debs was a lawbreaker at large, an enemy of the human race. Federal courts intervened and issued an injunction against the striking workers. They said because the workers had obstructed mail, their labor movement was now illegal. But the court's ruling did not stop them from continuing to interfere with rail traffic. The angry employees also began destroying parts of Pullman's company town. On July 8th, President Grover Cleveland sent the United States Army to stop the violence. He ordered 20,000 troops to crush the strikes and operate the railroads. 30 workers were killed in the violence. Thousands more were blacklisted and never allowed to work for the railroads again. Additionally, Eugene Debs was sent to federal prison for violating a court order. Within days of the military intervention, the strike was over. The American Railway Union's power was short-lived. After Eugene Debs was sent to prison, the Pullman Company reopened. All union organizers were immediately fired. Despite the victory against workers, George Pullman's reign of terror was near an end. Aftermath. Although the United States government and newspapers supported George Pullman's efforts, he did not escape the strike unscathed. His reputation was destroyed throughout most of the country. In response, Grover Cleveland created a presidential commission to investigate what happened. The final report claimed that much of the blame was due to George Pullman's belief in paternalism. Furthermore, the report also stated that George created much of the financial hardship experienced by the residents of his town, And finally, they said that the way he ran the community was completely un-American. George Pullman wouldn't have to endure his tattered reputation for long. On October 19, 1897, he died of a heart attack at 66 years old. The Pullman family was worried that angry workers might vandalize George's grave and desecrate his body, so they placed his remains in a lead-lined coffin. Then it was sealed inside a block of concrete. On top of that, steel rails were placed around the final resting place. Then more concrete was poured on top. The strategy was successful in keeping George Pullman's remains safe. In 1898, the state of Illinois filed suit against the Pullman Company. The state won, and the town of Pullman was annexed by Chicago. When the town of Pullman was constructed, the centerpiece of the town was a building dedicated to George's daughter. It was called Hotel Florence and was intended to demonstrate the wealth and morality brought forth by paternalism. However, by the 1930s, it was one of the most popular brothels in the greater Chicago area. If you want to learn more about labor movements in the United States, then you might enjoy a previous episode called Battle of Blair Mountain. It was the largest violent uprising since the Civil War and began as a strike by coal miners. If you are curious to learn more about Eugene Victor Debs, he has appeared in a previous episode as well. You can learn about how he was sent to prison again for speaking against the government in the Sedition Act of 1918. Was George Pullman an evil man or just misguided? More importantly, are those with extreme wealth more moral than the rest of us? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you found this episode interesting, then please hit the like button so other people can see it too. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more stories in the future. You never have to worry that we will use our wealth to inflict suffering, mostly because this channel is an expense for us. That's why at the end of every episode we like to mention that we accept PayPal donations, have a Patreon, and a merchandise store on our website. Links are in the video description if you are interested. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.